Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for TWiT specials is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is TWiT special number 133, recorded July 13th, 2012. The truth about bandwidth caps. This TWiT special is brought to you by Slingbox, which can turn your iPad into a television. With the iPad app from Slingbox, you can watch your home TV on your iPad anywhere you go. Check it out at slingbox.com/twit. Welcome to TWiT special number 133. I'm Tom Merritt, and we are trying something new here, a single topic special about an important issue that everybody cares about, bandwidth caps. Recent news, Time Warner testing out voluntary caps, trying not to upset the consumers as much by saying, we won't make you do a cap, but if you agree to one, we'll give you a $5 discount in exchange for a 5 gigabyte cap, and then we'll only charge you $1 per gigabyte overage, up to $25. Of course, Comcast has had a 250 gigabyte cap for a long time. Not too long ago, a couple months ago in May, they dropped that cap, and they're testing a tiered service, a couple different ways of going after a 300 gigabyte cap that would charge you $10 per 50 gigabytes overage. Of course, all the major wireless carriers in the U.S. have caps, except for Sprint, still offering an unlimited plan. But we're going to stick to talking about wired caps, and specifically this is an issue for folks who want to do television. They want to do video. They want to do VoIP, and they don't want to have to think about every bit they're tracking, and especially if they're getting their internet from a cable company. There's a competing interest there. Should I use Netflix or Hulu or something like that when I'm going to be using it against my bandwidth cap, or should I use the video-on-demand service that is offered by my cable company, which in Comcast's recent case wouldn't count against your bandwidth cap? A lot of issues to talk about here, and we got some great folks to join us and talk about it, folks who work in the industry and know what's really going on with bandwidth caps and why consumers are having to deal with them. We're going to get into some of those questions, but let me introduce the panel. First of all, in the studio, I'm actually at San Diego at Comic-Con, and Dane Jasper, CEO of SonicNet, is in the studio. Thanks for coming in, Dane. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you.
That's all right. I think I got your seat, Tom. Thanks.
And SonicNet is, of course, a provider of Internet, not only DSL, but other high-speed Internet as well, correct?
Yeah, I think we've got the cheapest gigabit in the nation. So we've got a fiber to the home product, and then we've got copper, a 20 megabit product in California.
So Dane can talk about getting the internet to your house. Reid Fishler, director at Hurricane Electric Internet Services, can help us understand a little bit what happens on the backbone. Welcome, Reid.
Very good. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for joining us today as well. Also, a couple other experts to join us. Benoit Felten, CEO and co-founder of Diffraction Analysis. You may have heard the name. He has written some pretty influential studies about bandwidth congestion and what effect it actually has on the consumer. Benoit, thank you for joining us in the evening for you.
Yes, from Paris.
From Paris, France. And Christopher Mitchell, director of Telecommunications Commons Initiative out east. Chris does a lot of work with helping communities create their own internet in ways to provide a little more competition to the other ISPs. Chris, welcome as well.
Thank you.
All right, I want to give a little background to what the issues are that we want to talk about over this next hour, and then we'll get into these questions and ask these folks. If you're in the chat room live right now, live.twit.tv, and you've got some questions, throw them in there. We'll try to keep up there as well. Let's start by... We're not really talking about bandwidth when we're talking about bandwidth caps so much. We're talking about usage and capacity. Capacity is perishable. It's not like you keep a big bucket of bits around and you dole them out slowly over the month. If you have a 250 gigabyte cap, they only have 250 gigabytes in the bucket. That's not the way it works. Networks get congested at peak times, and they spend most of the day underutilized. So if you've got a 250 gigabyte bandwidth cap and you only ever use the internet at 2 a.m., that cap does nothing to ease congestion if 2 a.m. is when no one else is using the network. During off-peak, the cost of additional users is almost nothing, whereas during peak times, additional users impose costs on users, but not necessarily on the provider. We'll ask these guys about what those costs actually are, those underlying costs. Also, the internet is a network of networks. A packet from New York may run on 3 to 4 networks to get to LA, and ISPs have an interest in limiting the number of traffic they have to deal with coming in from the outside. And we've seen some backbone disputes in the past over just that sort of issue. Metering is a way to discourage usage, but it discourages usage at all times, not just at peak times. So it's a little bit of a blunt instrument. And metering incurs costs on the provider. They have to run meters. They have to handle the billing. They have to answer questions and complaints when people don't understand why they went over. And caps may discourage innovative uses. That's the other problem here. Things like watching television, using VoIP that we talked about earlier. Comcast has estimated it would take about 288 gigabytes a month to replace a pay TV service with an internet-based service. There's no coincidence that their cap is 300 gigabytes, I would guess, because that doesn't leave you a whole lot of room to do much else. Users don't like metering either. They hate it because even if it does save them money, they don't want to think about it. It's called mental accounting. You don't want to sit there going, well, should I watch this episode of Star Trek on Netflix? I'm not sure how close to the meter I am. You want unlimited, even if it costs you more. That's been shown. So let's start. And Dane, I'll throw this to you, but anybody jump in and help if you have insight on it. What happens when a network gets congestion? Is there a better metaphor than the bucket of bits?
I think there's been a lot of ridicule of the pipes or tubes metaphor, but I think it is a good analog. And if there's too much traffic at a given moment, and this is a momentary thing, then traffic is dropped and there's congestion. So in a case of congestion, first you'll see latency go up as traffic begins to buffer. And then when those buffers are full, you'll see traffic begin to drop. So you'll see latency rise, and then you'll see packet drops. You'll see packet loss increase. And the answer for a service provider is to build more capacity. You need to increase the size of whatever segment of the link is congesting.
So it's like building more highways. Is a highway metaphor work in this situation? It's like if the traffic's getting backed up in the morning, you add some more lanes?
Yeah, and in some ways, that metaphor carries even into the latency. You see a highway. If it's not over full, everybody's scooting along at 10 miles over the speed limit. It gets a little over full, everybody backs up, and it gets worse. And so a congesting network, you'll see latency go up in a similar sort of way. So that metaphor makes some sense.
Although we never get jackknifed bits, thank goodness.
Correct.
Not that I anyway. Reid, you deal with this on the backbone side of things, and it's a similar problem there as well. But how does it differ for someone who's trying to provide the connectivity of all these different networks?
Well, the difference to us is we have very large pipes between multiple cities. So we're less concerned with whether or not you are streaming Netflix as to whether or not the World Cup is occurring, because then you have hundreds or thousands of people then all doing something together, which will increase traffic on the backbone. We're going to be engineering things to make sure that when those special events happen, we're ready for them on the backbone. We usually have very, very predictable bell curves that allow us to predict when we need to add more capacity to the backbone links that go into between cities of the world.
So if I get this right, the issue is you have to build your infrastructure to handle the most usage you think you'll ever get. And probably to keep costs down, you may aim a little below the most usage you'll ever get, because it's not going to happen very often. And the issue with bandwidth usage is if everybody at 9 p.m. is all watching Netflix, then that means I have to have infrastructure that can support all of those people watching at 9 p.m., and that infrastructure is going to run all day anyway, and I have to pay for it. It's a capital cost. Do I have that right, Dane?
Yeah. You have to build for that peak time. Service providers may, build for not enough capacity and count on congestion. And you'll see this in shared edge situations where, for example, a cable internet connection where you're sharing the connection with your neighborhood. In that kind of an environment, it'll congest, and that is expected. And so at peak times, it'll slow down for everybody. And, that's really about capital expense and the investment in the network and the decision-making that the provider engages in around how competitive the product needs to be measured against the cost of investment in the infrastructure.
Now, Chris, I want to bring you in on this because it sounds like this is a technical problem. But a lot of people say, well, wait a minute. A lot of these ISPs have a vested interest in keeping you from using other services on the internet because they want to sell you their own. Is it an economic or a technical problem, or is it a little bit of both?
Well, I think it depends on how you want to define it. If we had a highway that was one lane and it was congested all the time, you could say that was a technical problem. But really, it's a problem that has other roots. So in this case, we have a situation where providers have an incentive, I think, to push the limits and say how much can we oversubscribe our links before we'll lose customers or before people will get very frustrated. And so the problem ultimately is that we have a few providers. In most places, it's a cable company that's offering faster speeds than a DSL company. And so it's really sort of a cable monopoly that says how much can we delay investment in order to make more profits and not lose customers. We see in the advanced fiber optic networks, we don't really see these problems so much. We don't see Verizon's Fios system worrying about caps. We don't see the really advanced community networks that are all fiber optic really worrying about these caps. And that's because they're not worried about congestion because they've invested in the proper technology for our day and for our future. But there's a different problem that I hope we'll get into in a little bit, which is the economic problem of if you give everybody a gig, then you start running into an economic problem of congestion driving up your costs or of too much usage driving up your costs.
Well, yeah, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about that. What does that mean? If everybody's got a gig, it drives up the cost. I thought if you build the capacity for everybody to have a gig, then everybody can use it. What costs are you talking about?
Well, I think Dane has the exact experience with this, but the cost for Dane to deliver a bit to any of his customers, to deliver a gigabit, is essentially free. It's the cost of electronics once he's accounted for the capital. But the cost for him to deliver his customers to the internet means he has to pay someone else for that capacity. And the way those contracts are typically worked out, if you have a peak time when a lot of people are using the internet, that drives up your costs very significantly for the entire month, even if for the vast majority of the month you don't come very close to that peak. And so your peaking time can be very concerning. And that's something that I'm sure Dane will have more to say about, and I know Benoit dealt with it as well.
Yeah, let's bring Benoit into this. So if we're depending whether it's technical or whether it's economic, or it sounds like the ISPs are trying to figure out how do we handle that peak time. We can spend money and increase capacity to handle it, but at a certain point, we're spending a lot more money than we have, or maybe than we want to in some cases. And so they put in bandwidth caps as a way to manage that congestion. Benoit, how effective is that?
Before I answer that, I just want to go back to a couple of things that were said earlier. The first of these things is I don't think there's a technical issue. We know how to deal with traffic. We know how it works. Maybe a better solution than TCP/IP could be devised, but right now that's what we have, and to be honest, it's pretty damn resilient. So I don't think there's a technical issue. There's an investment issue, as was highlighted, and then there's a real-time cost issue. Potentially, the thing that I find quite astounding in this debate is that every analysis that I have seen shows that the actual cost of real-time bandwidth, so if you eliminate the fixed cost of investing in a state-of-the-art network, is actually a very, very small portion of your overall costs. I mean, we're talking single-digit percents, maybe even less than 1% in some cases. So if that's the case, if that cost doubles every year, you don't really have a problem. And you don't really need to reflect that on your customers either, at least not for a long time. So I think the cost equation is really focused on the investment side of things. Now, to your direct questions, do bandwidth caps work to fluidify traffic? I don't think so. I think what they do is they basically create a mental disposition within users to use it less overall. But I think when your network gets congested, it gets congested. And I would love to see actual data by ISPs saying, well, this is when we've put in the bandwidth caps. Everything else stayed exactly the same. And, this is how much less congestion we've had. I don't think that there is data to support that. It's my gut feeling. I haven't seen the data, but I suspect that is the case. The other thing is, as you mentioned yourself, caps are extremely blunt instruments. So the study that we published a few months ago that basically analyzed traffic from real users and looked at who would be affected by caps and who wouldn't, showed that basically 85% of what you could qualify as high capacity users or intensive users are not targeted by caps. So, if you put a mechanism in place that's supposed to regulate traffic and 85% of the people who should be targeted aren't, it's not really effective. At least not to do that.
When you say the people who should be, you're saying that the people who are using so much that they contribute to the congestion at the peak times?
But exactly, but that's the important point. So in our study, we devised specific terminology to distinguish the real-time usage from the overall usage. So we called the overall usage data consumption, and that's what the caps are built on. It's so many gigs a month. That's data consumption. And then bandwidth usage is how much of the overall capacity you as a single user are pulling at any given time. Now, if you target the people who are at the top of that stack, the people who are pulling the most at any given time, 85% of those are not targeted by caps. So effectively, that leads me to a conclusion, which is that it's not just a blunt instrument. It's clearly not an instrument to regulate real-time usage. It might be an instrument to do other things, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that, like generate more traffic, delay investment, and potentially block out competing over-the-top services. But I don't think that as a mechanism to regulate the traffic, the bandwidth caps work, and the data we've analyzed seems to support that.
Dane, I'm not asking you to open up your own books here when I say this, but just in general in the industry, do you think Benoit is right that the investment of the equipment is not significant enough to really cause a problem, that everybody, if they just open up the purse strings a little, could add enough capacity that they wouldn't need to bother with bandwidth caps?
Just to clarify, that's not exactly what I said.
Okay.
What I said was the transit costs, so what you pay in real time to an internet, a backbone internet provider, that cost is a very small part. If you have to invest in the technical capacity to increase your own network, that's a significant cost, but that's not a variable cost. It's a fixed cost.
Right. It's a sunk cost. In other words, you pay it once, and you don't have to keep paying it as you get more users and more service. So Dane, let me rephrase that question then, and thank you for clarifying, Benoit. Once you sink those costs in, your transit costs are low to places like the backbone providers where Reid works. What keeps people from investing? Is it just that they want to protect the bottom line and maximize costs?
Well, I think it'd be interesting to hear from Reid if he's got any information about the trend in decreasing costs in internet transit. And, we've been in business 17 years now providing internet access. The cost of transit, that is the edge, pushing things off of the network that we control and into backbones that will carry that traffic to or from the world, that cost has done nothing but decrease, as it should in a very energetically competitive marketplace. So these big backbone providers are buying bigger DWDM equipment, bigger routers, faster ports, and the cost of that equipment is going down, and it's a competitive marketplace. So companies like HE and others that sell global internet transit are driving down the cost of that. So today, for Sonic.net, the cost of internet transit for us is less than 2% of revenue. And so, if we see a doubling or tripling in consumption, that doesn't cost us a lot at the edge of our network. To Benoit's point, in the middle mile and at the edge, there are capital expenses that are fixed one-time costs for network upgrades that would need to be made in order to clear more traffic to and from customers. But the costs of those components have only decreased as well. So, you don't expect to spend for a computer 2 years from now the same amount of money and get less or the same computing capacity. And routers are just computers. And the cost of routers, router interfaces, the optics that plug into them, and all of the infrastructure components that carry the traffic across our middle mile, and the cost of edge access equipment is only getting cheaper at a pace that's much greater than we're seeing the appetite for consumption going up. So, I would argue that, we have a trend towards cost zero effectively.
So why is it, if the costs are going down, and Reid, you're in a business where there's good competition, there's lots of backbone providers. Why is it that we don't see the same thing as consumers? The cost isn't really going down a lot. I think some studies say it's been going down, but it hasn't been going down maybe as fast as you might expect for consumer access, and they're putting limits on it.
The price is going up for consumers. The price is going down if you adjust that for the amount of capacity. But I'm paying more year after year to Comcast for this connection. I don't want to cut off the other person who started speaking.
Chris, I think you're right, but I think what's important to understand is that we've seen, as Chris said earlier in his introduction, we've seen the companies that have invested in their edge networks and made them future-proof don't have this problem. What we've seen is in the best cases, places like Minnesota or Iowa, where there isn't an entrenched company who is really the monopolist. And you're seeing a lot of independent telecoms come up and doing very interesting things with fiber networks. And Dane is doing the same thing in California, where you're seeing people who don't have a ton invested in it, the same exact piece of copper to your house that you've had for 50 years, and they're not trying to stretch more out of it and trying to use the exact same thing. You're not using the same car you did 50 years ago. You're not using the same car you did 20 years ago, odds are. That infrastructure itself needs to be maintained and replaced in order to make sure that everybody gets the speed that they should have and deserve. And we're seeing that in places where competition flourishes.
Right, and in Minnesota, as a Minnesotan, we're seeing, in the metro area, we have Comcast and we have CenturyLink, which is a very slow product in many places. Unless you live right on top of what's called the D-SLAM. In the rural areas, you have a lot of fiber to the home from cooperatives, actually. And I think that gets into the rational business decision of CenturyLink, which is to say, we're not going to compete with Comcast on speed. We're going to compete with Comcast on price. And so why would they want to invest on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars when they can do very well and get a proper return by offering $20 a month packages, knowing that a significant part of the market will be satisfied with that, even if it's a slow speed. And even though it's DSL, it does get congested. It's just on a different link than cable networks get congested on.
But Dane could probably answer to this as to the people of Minnesota, and we do a lot of business in Minnesota, and we see a lot of independent telecoms there. The problem is that getting somebody to allow you to dig up the streets in the middle of a city is almost impossible. It takes a lot of money, takes a lot of permits, and these companies were allowed to do that a long time ago, and they still have the ability, they still have the right of ways, but yet they should be increasing that investment in the ground, and if they're not doing it, then they shouldn't be allowed to have that ability.
To your point, Reid, clearly somebody needs to make a substantial investment in pushing new infrastructure to the premise. So, you see Google building fiber to the home. Verizon is the largest fiber provider in North America. We're building fiber to the premise in some locations. But what's interesting is that on networks using copper, whether it's coaxial or twisted pair, those networks are not, they're being artificially constrained. And I really think that this is a business model decision. Benoit made the point that, consumers with a meter hanging over their head are going to behave a little differently. But I think also, the opportunity to shut out competing businesses that are delivering over-the-top, particularly heavy video content, is a primary driver for caps.
I think there's another aspect here, just very quickly, and maybe this is a more of an international perspective on this, but there's actually only a few countries in the world where caps have become the norm. And what you see essentially is that there are two reasons why caps are the norm. One is that you have a very real issue with transit. And that is, for example, the case in New Zealand and Australia, although I think even that's overstated. And the second one is you have very limited competition in the access. If you have only two players in the access, which is what you get for most of the US, then they're both happy to not overinvest, not be very competitive on price. And bandwidth caps is a good way of doing that. If you look at most countries in Europe, there are no bandwidth caps because you have three or more competitors. And if you have three or more competitors, one of them is going to come in and say, well, my service is all you can eat. And as soon as one of them does that, he gets the upper hand in the market and the others have to follow. So I think it's important not to forget that there's a competitive issue there. There might be a competitive issue that leads to caps also in Reid's business if there is a lack of competition in a given location. Now, at a national scale, you can say there's competition, but there's probably some places where the transit costs a hell of a lot more than others. And that can be a legitimate reason to start looking into bandwidth caps. But generally, I think that most of what we see as an issue with caps would be solved by a healthy competitive market.
Sure. All right, I think a quick break and continue this conversation in just a second. But I want to thank Dane, Jasper, CEO of SonicNet, Reid, Fishler, Director at Hurricane Electric, Benoit Felten, CEO and co-founder at Diffraction Analysis, and Christopher Mitchell, Director of the Telecommunications as Commons Initiative, for being with us to talk about bandwidth caps today. And, of course, whenever we do breaking news or specials like this one, it's not exactly breaking news, but it's a special explainer to try to help consumers who are frustrated understand the big issues in technology that are facing them. And it's brought to you by Slingbox. Slingbox is different. Some companies say their system lets you watch TV everywhere. Slingbox does it. They let you watch your home TV anywhere you go. You can control it. Watch your DVR, watch everything you have at home. You don't have to pay extra for special services. You buy the software, you buy the hardware, and then you get to do everything with your content that you want. It's making use of that internet connection that we're talking about today. You're not limited to certain channels. It works with an iPad. It works with any smartphone, iPod Touch, laptops, tablets. To get started with Slingbox, you connect it to the internet. You connect it to your home TV. Anywhere you can get an internet signal, you can watch your home TV. It's that easily. Slingbox is available at Best Buy and Amazon. You can learn more at slingbox.com/twit. And we thank them for supporting these kinds of specials and breaking news events when they happen. Whenever news breaks, Twit will be there. We thank Slingbox for their support for that. All right, I didn't mean to slow us down there because I think we were really getting to the heart of this matter, which is that it seems that a lack of competition or maybe bandwidth caps are a symptom indicating that there is not as much competition as there needs to be in the marketplace. Reid, I think you were about to say something before I broke in. Is that right?
I did want to just say that I agree with Benoit. There are certain areas where what we're talking about just doesn't apply. If you live in American Samoa, or if you live in some place that has no major city near it and it costs a tremendous amount of money to drag fiber to it to connect it to the rest of the world, then bandwidth caps may be somewhat appropriate due to the fact of the cost of the backhaul. What we're really talking about here is metropolitan areas, the United States, Canada, most of Europe, and a lot of Asia. So there are some areas, as Benoit said, where the cost of transit may be, or transport to transit, may be a significant cost barrier. But generally, what we're all talking about is, yes, there are artificial limits being put in place.
Reid, that's just a competition problem again. There aren't multiple transport providers carrying fiber and service over that fiber to those locations. So it might be a submarine cable, or it might just be a long-haul cable out to a very rural market. I think Benoit's point is really well made, that whether it's edge access sold directly to consumers or internet transit and transport to and from backbones, it's lack of competition that drives high cost or capping behaviors.
Sure, and I would agree with that. The issue I just wanted to make is obviously, and Dane, I'm normally arguing your point here, but the point I'm just making is there are areas where it costs a tremendous amount of money to drag that cable, and we're not going to see 30 different companies drag a submarine cable to American Samoa, no matter how much we want that to happen. Just there's not enough business there. And
that's the thing, is that maybe there's only one large transport provider who's hauled a fiber to a given location. Now they have a monopoly on the backbone connection in and out of that location. Their cost to deliver, the router ports and the wave division multiplexing equipment, the cost per bit on that glass that goes to that location is only decreasing. The capacity is only increasing. But because of a lack of competition, somebody needs to string a second line before that problem gets solved.
And it's starting to happen in some places. I mean, typically Australia and New Zealand had that problem crucially for years, and that's starting to be addressed now. There's a second Trans-Pacific cable, and apparently there's a third on the way. So if there's, to Reid's point, if there's sufficient business competition, ultimately, I think in the backbone will happen. Presumably there are places where there isn't enough business to justify more than one guy investing. And in that case, yes, there's a competition problem, but there's not necessarily a solution to that problem.
Now, Reid just said that bandwidth caps actually would be justified, or not justified, but they're understandable in that situation. But Benoit, you were saying they don't actually help the congestion. Even if you are a single provider and you can get away with it, are you using bandwidth caps just so you can charge more money? Or is it actually helping congestion? It doesn't sound like it actually solves the problem.
It all depends on the level of your cap. So what the mind frame that you guys probably have is this kind of 200, 250 gig per month cap. Until very recently in New Zealand, most caps were 20 gig. And the overage charges were punitive. So, depending on how you set up your cap, you can literally stop people from using most of the internet. In which case, you do address your price problem, because nobody is going to want to get even near to the point where you're going to pay overage charges.
Sure. No, go ahead, Benoit.
No, go on.
I think it's important to realize, and Tom, you alluded to this in the beginning of the show, that the internet is a network of networks. So you may have, in the example I was using, within American Samoa, there's absolutely no, and I'm not an expert in the network there, I'm just using it as an example, but there should be no reason why the network there has any problem talking to itself. Where I'm using that bandwidth caps may be of any assistance is where there is no transit available at all. And I'm certainly not rooting for bandwidth caps at all. All I'm saying is, even there, if a network such as Dane's grew there, you should not have any constraints in talking to the people of your area. If the only issue is whether or not there's enough ability to get back to the rest of the internet, which is going to be the other networks you're connected to. But the major cable networks and telecom networks don't have this problem, especially when you're in any sort of major metropolitan area.
And there's another piece, too, I think, as we talk about the various issues of whether this is a technical or an economic, you ask a question of who made this decision at maybe Comcast or something, and why are they doing it? It's not exactly clear to me. Dane knows why he makes decisions, right? Because he's the one making them, or he knows the people who are making them. At Comcast, CenturyLink, AT&T, we're talking about a wholly different creature. We're talking about organizations of tens of thousands of individuals. Who knows why they make decisions? It's not often for very good reasons. And so as I listen to Benoit talk about reasons why they may have done it, I think it's hypothetical. We don't really know why a massive corporation makes these decisions, and it's often not for rational reasons. And so I think it's important to separate out the decisions that are made by a small company on the basis of perhaps the economics that Reid's talking about, versus a very large company like Comcast, which really, they're not paying for their bandwidth, right? I mean, people are peering with them and paying them typically, or it's for free. The largest guys fundamentally operate on a different paradigm.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that. I think that's a very important point that Chris just made. When we were researching our report, Do Data Caps Punish the Wrong Users?, we spoke to a fair number of ISPs. And what you see is that when you talk to the people who handle the data and know how to handle the data, they have a pretty accurate view of customer usage. But when you talk to people at strategy levels who decide on pricing policy, they don't understand this stuff. And it's honestly, it's complex to understand. You know, the reason that we published this report was to try and you know, make it as legible as possible. But this is complex statistical stuff. And as a consequence, as the information goes up to decision makers, it gets diluted to the point where, you know, they don't necessarily understand the difference between overall data consumption and spot bandwidth usage and things like that. So I think Chris is absolutely correct. And I think, you know, if the service providers are being honest about this, then the very least that they should be willing to do is actually release data on why they came to these decisions. And what we're seeing is they're not doing it. In fact, our report started with us publishing, you know, a kind of a diatribe about this 2 years ago, and Dane getting in touch with us and saying, well, we're willing to share that data, and because we're interested in seeing what comes out of it. And that was the origin of this report. So I think Chris's point is very important. We can't assume that all these decisions are made rationally and with a correct understanding of what users are doing.
Now, I just want to point out at this juncture that I did invite Time Warner, Comcast, and Cablevision. I sent emails to their press contacts telling them about this special, asking if they would like to send a representative, and I just didn't hear back from them. So it's not like we were trying to keep them out. And Dane, I know it's a little unfair to kind of lean on you to be the representative of all consumer ISPs here. But I want to ask you a question, again, industry-wide. It sounds like, okay, bandwidth caps really only effective if you're in a situation where you just have to beat the customer down into not using too much any time because you're in an isolated situation. And otherwise, it's questionable the reasons for putting them into place, but they might be good if they targeted the times when there's peak usage. Is there a better way than just blunt all the time bandwidth caps? Is there a way to say, well, you'll have unlimited internet all the time except between 7 and 10 p.m., kind of like the old phone long-distance companies? You got free long distance all day long except in the evenings, or free long distance in the evenings, not during the day. Yep. Is there an alternative?
Yeah, and, you know, we lived with this in the cellular industry for a long time, and it was free nights and weekends, right? So certainly broadband companies could do a free nights and weekends concept. And, you know, and I think we would see that if capping was intended to deal with the technical problem of congestion. And I would argue that caps are not intended to deal with the technical issue or the capital expense involved in congestion. You know, my argument is that, you know, caps are fundamentally about monetizing the network to its maximum, so charging for overages, and you certainly see that in wireless to a great degree, less so in wireline. And number two, protecting other business models. And so all of, you know, if you speak domestically about the United States, you look at the big telcos and the big cable companies, they're all television companies. And so preventing the replacement of the sort of average household streaming video entertainment with over-the-top content is, you know, you have to recognize that as a primary motivator for capping.
Is that the case, Chris? I mean, you're fighting this battle all the time to get municipalities to be able to roll their own, and companies are coming in and putting pressure not to allow it. In some cases, they've even got laws put on the books saying that a municipality can't provide its own internet. It has to be provided privately, or there's restrictions that encourage it to be provided privately. Is it as conspiracy theory-minded people might say, that they just want to force you to spend their money on cable television and prop up an old business model?
I think any business, particularly a publicly traded one, that's not seeking ways of preventing competition as a means of boosting their profit, may be violating the fiduciary responsibility they have to their stakeholders. Fundamentally, I think that's one of the problems with this whole discussion, which is that we talk about broadband delivery and access to the internet as though it was just another business, when it's not. It's become a fundamental infrastructure. It's essential for our economy. And so, when you have laws that say that a community cannot build its own network, which communities only do if they're dissatisfied with the service they're getting from existing providers or a lack of providers. Those sorts of barriers to community networks, I think, are fundamentally wrong. So, but what I also see in relation to community networks in this is community networks have some of those problems, like American Samoa, where in that rural Minnesota, you may be in an area where the only connection you can get to the internet is from the incumbent telephone company, and they want to charge you as much as possible. And so they worry about their peak capacity, not because they can't deliver it to consumers, but because they need to be able to afford to connect it. And this is, once again, where I want to talk about scale and just say that, once again, the problems that Dane faces are different from the problems that a major company, a large company, faces. But these problems can also be solved by caching. Netflix recently announced a solution that will hopefully dramatically decrease the cost of smaller networks for delivering content, which I think will reduce the arguments for bandwidth caps. The more you can have these very heavy streams being delivered locally, rather than having to go out on the internet that you have to pay for, the less excuse there is for any bandwidth cap anywhere.
Well, Chris, I think the other thing that's important to recognize is that the other thing that can solve most of this is peering, and this this really relates to the fact of whether or not these companies want to keep their little islands as independent as they can, and they don't want to trade traffic with various other companies. There is easy ways to get traffic from A to B, and there may be artificial limits put in place because some company in Chicago does not want to interconnect with a company that's in the rack next to them. The simple cable will fix that problem, but they want to charge money to get that traffic from that space to the other space. They're not interested in making their customers' performance any better. They're actually more interested in making money, and that's the backbone world in itself. And Dane could probably talk to this. Anything that he peers with probably is not a problem for him. He's more than willing to truck that traffic on his network and bring it to his peer. There's no cost, and it's very easy, and it makes life easy. It's the artificial problems that some networks have where they don't even want to trade the traffic that they have on their own networks.
Right. I think that's typically the bigger guys in my experience.
Yeah, it seems to be something we've seen with Comcast, disputes with Level 3, Netflix, that sort of thing. Dane, do you have any comments to what Reid's saying? Do you have a perspective on that?
We're in California. This is kind of the, hub of the internet, and therefore transit and transport costs are really, really low. And, I think a small service provider in a very rural market is going to have its own transport problems. But that is not the majority of households. The majority of premises live in a reasonable metropolitan area with adequate competition in transit and transport. And the costs of that, whether it's peering, transit, transport, the costs of that are really irrelevant as to the cost of delivering service to a consumer. Whether somebody uses 100 gigs or 300 gigs, it doesn't matter. Bandwidth isn't a natural resource. We meter it like it is, and consumers are accepting that metering. And, they use analogies like, well, you wouldn't expect to use all the power in your house or all the water without a meter. But bandwidth isn't a natural resource like power or water. It's not natural gas that's extracted and converted into power and transported. It's not water that's purified and pumped. It's basically interfaces. It's optics at the end of fiber optic lines that have a one-time capital cost to them. The other side of the coin is that consumers consume to the limits of their ability to consume. So, in other words, they have a certain amount of hard drive space, and they have a certain number of screens. And, one household might have, a bunch of college kids and their roommates, and they're all streaming Netflix. They're going to use more than a household with one TV or one screen and a solo person. But fundamentally, the difference between those two is not that great. And eventually they fill up their hard drives, or eventually they're streaming to all their screens. So what we see is our customers who are connected to our copper networks at 20 megabits or our fiber network at 100 megabits or 1 gigabit, they use about the same amount. And so, the combination of the fact that this isn't a natural resource, this is a fabricated resource, a fabricated asset, where the costs of that fabrication are only decreasing as the cost of transistors drops and the speed of processing increases, combined with the fact that people will use a limited amount because they can only stream and consume and store so much. Hard drives cost money. They're going to download stuff, fill them up. They might buy more hard drives. There's certainly, what you'd call digital pack rats who will, collect a lot of content over time. But the average consumer, they're just going to consume the resources that fill up their screens and hard drives. And then they stop, no matter how fast a connection you give them.
And the electricity is actually really an important parallel, I think, because if we had an electrical network that operated like our broadband network, no one would have air conditioning. It would not work. It would operate only in peak times, and therefore the grid would fall apart if everyone tried to use it. The network was specifically over-engineered to make sure that people had the capacity so that if I run around my house and turn on every light right now in the early afternoon, I can do that. And I think that's because we take electricity seriously. Our policymakers take it seriously. Our policymakers right now only talk about taking broadband seriously, but they really don't because they refuse to deal with things like these caps and a variety of other topics that TWiT regularly covers.
It's a free market approach. The idea is that competition will solve the problems. And, in 1996, the U.S. embarked on an open model. We passed the Telecom Act. That encouraged deployment by many service providers. And then in 2002, we began to rewind from that from a regulatory perspective. So the policy philosophy was that more competition wasn't the answer, and that instead we should have multimodal competition. We should have cable competing with telco, competing with wireless, broadband over power lines, and satellite, and that would be enough competition. And I think, what we've now shown 10 years on is that wasn't enough competition. And, you look to Europe and Asia, and you see gigabit connections prevalent in South Korea and Japan. You see the aggressive pricing in Europe, and I would argue that a more chaotic and competitive environment, as was pursued in Asia and Europe, was a better outcome.
So there's one thing I wanted to stress. Sorry.
No, please do, Benoit.
Just about what Dane said. I mean, someone mentioned that the possibility that the service providers who were capping were effectively trying to. Mentioned that it was kind of a conspiracy theory to block out Netflix and things like that. I don't like the idea of calling it a conspiracy theory because I think that it's a rational decision from the corporate levels at which it was taken. The other thing which I think is very important, and Dane alluded to it, is I think the service provider sold us broadband by saying it was all you can eat. And if you look at it, happened the same way with mobile. I mean, these things did not pick up until they said, okay, you can use it no matter what. And by doing that, they basically projected in consumers' minds that you paid a flat fee every month and you could use it as much as you wanted. And 10 years on, they want to get away from that because now that virtually everyone who wants broadband has broadband, they can't find a way to grow that revenue anymore. And so they think the way to grow that revenue is to slowly go back to a model where if you use more, you pay more. Incidentally and interestingly, they're not moving to a model where if you use less, you pay less. But, you know.
I think that point makes the case that, you know, this isn't a technical decision. It's entirely a rational and cynical market decision. And, you know, to your point about unlimited and creating the picture in consumers' minds that unlimited was the norm, consumers' use of broadband bits, their consumption, has increased. But the cost to deliver those bits, transport them, transit them, peer them off, and deliver them to the edge has decreased at a greater pace than consumption. So, you know, that would argue that the imposition of caps is a demonstration of the failure of the marketplace from a competitive perspective, not we've got to do this because there isn't enough money to upgrade the networks. I think that, you know, crying poor from that perspective, it doesn't make sense. Intertie that to the fact that all the major companies in the U.S. anyway that are delivering broadband are also delivering television. And, you know, it seems very clear to me that protecting that side of the business is common sense.
Not only that, like we've actually got to the point, and we're going to have to start wrapping up this conversation. So I'm going to go around the table and get some final thoughts. But we've got to the point where we've identified that bandwidth caps may have some uses, but really what we're facing here is a lack of marketplace competition. What the cable ISPs are doing is perfectly rational behavior. You might do it, too, if you ran a cable company and could get away with it. You're trying to maximize your shareholder value. The problem is that is okay in a free marketplace of competition, and we don't seem to have that in the Internet. And, in fact, we're seeing indications that it's going backward. Verizon stopped rolling out their fiber. They're trying to get a spectrum deal with the cable companies that would essentially end competition between Verizon and the cable companies in exchange for the spectrum because they would market Verizon's wireless service. A lot of people fear that that could make things even worse. We had the launch of the spectrum wholesaler, Light Squared, fall apart because they couldn't get the permission to use the spectrum the way that they wanted to use it. Now they're facing bankruptcy. Dane, I'll start with you and then we'll go around. What do we do, not only as an industry but as consumers, to solve this? Because what we need to be doing is what you're doing, rolling out more fiber everywhere, but that's not something everybody's able to do.
You know, I think the formula for this is competition. And, you know, we're talking about municipal and community networks. I think if a community dislikes the viability of products, the competitiveness of products in their marketplace, they could band together as a community. And I think if an entrepreneur sees an opportunity, they should compete. You know, it is possible to deliver competitive broadband services in America. We haven't seen that be widespread in the United States the way that it is in Europe and in Asia. But I don't see regulatory barriers to that being possible, aside from legislation being passed in a number of states that makes it much harder for communities to publicly fund the construction of networks. But, you know, consumers should look for competitive options. If there aren't competitive options, they or their community should create those. And, you know, if there are competitive options, they should patronize them.
And the right-of-ways are owned by the community. That's a place to put pressure, right?
Certainly. The rights-of-way are owned by the community and can be used by, you know, any regulated carrier. So, you know, anybody who's an entrepreneur can start a carrier, and the community itself can use its right-of-way and string lines. They don't necessarily have to operate them. They could string glass, leave it dark, and invite operators. They could invite many competitors. And you see this in Europe, in Amsterdam, for example, you know, where publicly funded, they've strung a lot of fiber to every premise, and then there are multiple carriers who use that fiber, and that's a great model.
Reid, to you, your last thoughts from the backbone side of things. What can we do to make this not be a problem, to not need bandwidth caps?
I think what Dane said is perfectly right. I think what we have here is a situation where what we need is more, be it entrepreneurs or metropolitan areas or cities, to come out and create their own network, because there is the capacity out there. The internet is not full. Be it with ourselves or with any other backbone provider. Any metropolitan area can create their own network and hook up to a number of backbone providers and be able to open up the pipes and the floodgates, and it isn't a problem. There is bandwidth out there, and I think that's the message that you're hearing. And any other impediments to it is purely really artificial.
Chris, I have a feeling they're stealing some of your lines here, but what are your thoughts on what we can do?
Well, there's to say that we need more competition is one thing. I like to think of it as consumer choice, and I say that because I'm not sure competition will work in a number of areas. Certainly, metro areas is more likely than rural. The problem with competition is that there's a really strong argument to be made that this is a natural monopoly, and that it is inefficient to build too many networks, too many physical networks. What I'd love to see is something along the lines of Australia's national broadband network, although I'd much prefer to be locally owned. I think that's solves a lot of the problems. But specifically, competition isn't the only solution. Another solution is making sure that these networks have to be accountable to local citizens. And so it's slightly a different way of looking at it. But I think that you could do an entire show about what would we have to do to get more competition. And I think that would solve most of the other problems we talk about: caps, network neutrality, just all kinds of things, high prices. I think ultimately the first step is making sure that communities have the right to build a network if they so choose.
Benoit, the last word to you. You've studied this issue closely, and you're coming to us from Paris, so you have a different, more outside perspective to us here in the United States. What do you think we can do to deal with bandwidth caps?
Well, and I think that a lot of what's been said is exactly what I would have said. So I'm going to take a slightly different track here and say there's to a certain extent, there's a propaganda issue here as well. And I think what we could relatively easily do is address that. There could be some inquiry into forcing the large providers to anonymously release data that could actually show that the caps are not working and they're not doing what they're supposed to do, and there isn't a cost problem at that level. If you could do that, then that would put a lot more pressure on the established players to actually play fair. I think a big part of the issue, and if I compare it to Europe, that's certainly the case, is there is this assumption in the U.S. that as private companies, they don't have to release any data on anything. I mean, the whole broadband map thing was seen from Europe. It was completely crazy. In Europe, a regulator goes to a service provider and says, we have to know who you serve and where, and you don't have a choice. And spending hundreds of millions just to figure out who's serving where seemed completely crazy. And similarly, I think there should be some way to enforce a minimal release of data that actually allows policymakers and regulators to really assess these situations on the basis of hard data, not on the basis of hearsay.
I agree. I think we need data. Hopefully, those of you in the audience have got a little more data yourselves to be armed. If you call your ISP and you want to talk about bandwidth caps and you want to complain, you have some resources now. You have some knowledge. There's more out there on the web. I encourage you to check out diffractionanalysis.com. Look for the report, Do Data Caps Punish the Wrong Users? We'll have a link to that in our show notes. Also, Public Knowledge has a good report, Know Your Limits, Considering the Role of Data Caps in Usage-Based Billing and Internet Access Service. And check out the resources of all of our guests. I want to thank you again, Dane Jasper, CEO of SonicNet, Reid Fishler, Director at Hurricane Electric, Benoit Felten, co-founder and CEO, Diffraction Analysis, and Chris Mitchell, director of the Telecommunications as Commons Initiative. It was really kind of you to share your time and your expertise with everybody today. That's it for this TWiT special. Big thanks to Slingbox for bringing it to you, and a huge thanks to Skype for letting me camp in their trailer here. We used Skype for my call. We used it for most of our guest calls as well, and it worked great. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We'll do more of these specials in the future. Keep an eye out. Talk to you later.